All right, here in part two of the lecture, what we're going to be looking at is another aspect of mercantilism, another example, which is the slave trade. In the previous section, we looked at silver mining in Potosi, in modern-day Bolivia. Now we're going to look at a very long-running trade that takes place between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. You should start by pointing out that during this time, between 1500 and 1870, which is sort of the main run of the slave trade, slavery wasn't new in the 16th century. There had been slaves in the ancient and medieval world, but one of the major differences between slavery, which existed particularly in the ancient world, and it was widespread, the Greeks and the Romans all had slaves, but the main difference was that slavery then was what we refer to as situational. In most cases, these individuals were war captives, and in some cases, they were debt slaves. That is, they were paying off a debt. Um, and most of this slavery, a lot of times, this slavery was, in some cases, temporary. For example, debt slavery, you would go into debt for a certain period of time. But one of the most important elements of it was that slavery in the ancient world was not based on ethnicity, but it is based on ethnicity during this period of the early modern slave trade. So it didn't matter where you were from in the ancient world when you became a slave. Usually it was just a consequence of being conquered. Uh, you could be from Gaul, you could be from modern day France, or you could be from England, or you could be from Egypt, you could be from North Africa, you could be from Ethiopia. Didn't matter. But this form of slave trade that we're going to be looking at is exclusively focusing on Africans. And there will be specific explanations on the part of Europeans, justifications that don't make a lot of logical sense, but at the time they did, for why this occurred. Um, Now, in order to understand slave trade, you need to understand the triangle trade. And if you look at the first image there at the top, you see that this is a diagram sort of mapping out what we refer to as the triangle trade. Uh, and the way that this basically worked is that you would have, from Europe to Africa, you would have manufactured goods. Manufactured goods, things like cloth, guns, alcohol, these products would be sent from there to Africa, and they would then be used to purchase slaves and send those slaves over to the Americas. So to give you a sense of numbers, and you can see some of the charts below, although I'm going to give you a little bit of different numbers here. Slaves between 1502 and 1870, in terms of numbers imported, Mexico and Central America were somewhere around 200,000 slaves. 200,000 to 300,000 Africans were brought to Europe itself. In the United States, anywhere between 400,000 and 500,000, so roughly half a million. In Spanish South America, it could be somewhere up near 500,000 Africans were brought over. The Guianas, approximately half a million. Brazil, Brazil was anywhere between 3.6 and 5 million Africans brought over. The Caribbean had anywhere between 3.5 and 5 million. Those numbers are just people transported for slavery. That does not take into account any of those people born into slavery. You can see then that the slaves then are then used to produce and harvest raw materials, things like cotton, tobacco, sugar, coffee, silver, gold. And these too were then sent back to Europe in a lot of cases and refined and then sent to Africa as manufactured goods. And so this is how the triangle trade works. Now, the reason that it worked in Africa, at least from the Europeans' perspective, is that Africa at the time was divided into many small kingdoms, or in a lot of cases, even smaller kinship clans. Unlike Europe, many of these African kingdoms or clans, they did not measure wealth in terms of land and its potential, but in terms of material possession, things like slaves, many of whom were acquired in warfare. In fact, a lot of warfare amongst a variety of tribes in Africa was fought not for land, but for captives. Uh, a lot of times, slaves that were captured by African traders were then distributed to other Africans first, and then these sort of leftover slaves were then sent to the coast, where they were sold to European merchants. Now, the Portuguese are the first Europeans that begin trading slaves on a large scale, in part because they're the first around the Cape in the south, They set up trading forts along the coasts of Africa. The slave trade really began to take off around 1500 when they discovered that the islands of the South Atlantic were ideal for growing sugar, and they needed a labor force there. Later, the Dutch became more important in terms of transportation. Um, and in the second half of the 17th century, they were joined by the British and French trading companies. Profit for them is disputable. Some individuals reported a profit of 300%, but some traders reported a profit of something much lower, like 10%. Because so many factors could bring it down, they paid fees to African leaders, there were delays in loading, bad weather, losses in what we're going to refer to in a minute, the Middle Passage. It was still profitable for them, though, and for the plantation owners. And slave trade was a mercantilist activity. That is, it was regulated by the governments of Europe through taxing the merchants on the number of slaves they received and also using monopolistic trading companies in order to transport the slaves and the goods themselves. So, in terms of the process of enslavement, it's sort of a long and involved process. But what happens is that what had been a relatively small scale situation in Africa is exacerbated by the Europeans into a massive industry of slavery. This would require the coastal Africans to go further inland to conquer other people and bring slaves to the coast for the Europeans. Obviously, this involved a lot of geographic displacement, and we're talking numbers here into the several millions, tens of millions in some cases, of Africans being transported from their homelands, obviously unwillingly, and then thrown into these areas of the New World. One of the aspects that's important to understand about slavery itself is what the Middle Passage is. The Middle Passage is the transport from Africa to the New World, and this was the most dangerous part of the journey. In the mid-18th century, an average of 400 slaves were on board every ship. This was men chained together, right leg to left leg, in order to save space. Oftentimes, the slaves that were transported had less than half the amount of room given to convicts, immigrants, soldiers, so they had very little room on board the ships, rudimentary, if any, sanitary facilities, and they were just fed staple food like gruel just to enough to survive. Now, in terms of the mortality rates were anywhere between 8 and 30% of those traveling over. So, out of 100, you could lose up to 30 at a time in any transport across. The low estimates are that 1.5 million Africans died during the transport in the Middle Passage. But other estimates are much higher based on other sources, and it could be as high in over 8 million dead just in transport alone. This is caused by the long sailing times, disease, dysentery, shortage of food, weather changes, violent treatment, shipwreck. All of those things contribute to the terrible, terrible nature of the Middle Passage. So in terms of mortality, if you think about the numbers in the bottom of your screen on that chart there, those numbers are transported slaves living. But now imagine that there's more slaves, at least at the high estimate, there are more slaves that die in the process of being transported from Africa than were transported in total living. Those numbers are astonishingly high. So when you look at this map here, you can really see where a lot of the slave trade ends up bringing Africans. A vast majority, you can tell by the numbers we looked at before, a vast majority go to Brazil and the Caribbean. A lot of times the Caribbean was a stopping point for slaves as they were then shipped to other areas, including the United States. But you can see a vast majority of them come out of West Central Africa into Brazil, and then many of them along coastal Africa are then sent out to the areas of the Caribbean. Now, when you look at the description of the slave ship, and this is one of your assigned primary sources, you have a series of readings, but this one is an image here. This was promoted by an abolitionist movement, that is, people who wanted to stop slavery. And one of the ways that they tried to get slavery to end was to get people to realize what exactly the Middle Passage was like. And this image here should give you a description of just how terrible it was. What you see, figure 1 there, when you see the ship from the side, are the decks, 2 short decks on sort of the left top, and then 2 very long decks. And what you're seeing are those long decks down below. All of those markings that you see sort of around the edge of the ship there in the middle and bottom larger images, those are all people that are stacked right next to each other and then often on top of each other. You can see the cutaways on the left side there as well. And so you have hundreds of people crammed in there. They're not riding in the ship. This isn't any sort of a cruise by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that this image here should give you a sense of just exactly how they stored what they considered their product for transportation. So these are humans, that they would transport humans in this fashion from Africa to the New World as slaves. And this is part of the reason why the Middle Passage was considered one of the most, after the enslavement itself, one of the most atrocious aspects of slavery. Another thing you should be able to tell by looking at this image and the previous one, this one here, the description of the slave ship, this one here, the human storage in the ships themselves. One of the things you should be able to determine from this is part of the definition of mercantilism. That is, increase the wealth of the state by any means necessary. And in this case, it meant, in terms of human lives, that their lives are irrelevant to the broader economic goals of the state. So even much more so than the mining in Potosi, here you have the African slave trade, the slave trade of Africans to the Americas being a prime example of mercantilism, because the welfare of the people involved here is irrelevant to the broader goal of making money for the state by any means necessary. And in this case, if anywhere between 2 million and 8 million Africans died in the process of the Middle Passage, for mercantilists that was an acceptable number. For abolitionists, obviously that will not be something that is acceptable, and there were obviously moral qualms about that. But overall, as a system, mercantilism did not care about the people it affected. It did not care about those affected who were taken from their villages in Africa, who were taken from their families, who were separated, even if all of their families were captured and enslaved together, and then shipped and sold out to various areas. And they were treated as a uniform block. They were simply Africans. There was very little distinction given to the fact that they came from different villages, that they spoke different languages. From the European perspective, they were just simply a monolithic unit, Africans. So in the next section, we're going to look at why they chose Africans, and then how the economic system of mercantilism and slavery will come to an end.